Welcome to the Takeaways podcast. On today's episode, we are talking about an interesting topic in that whenever we have a conversation about tech in Africa, we usually talk about how the fintech apps are trying to provide the access to financial services, how, e-commerce is trying to do the same thing, etc., etc. But one thing that we really don't speak about is the digital infrastructure that really drives all these innovations, right? Because without the infrastructure, we really would not even have a chance to tell all these stories about the applications that are driving technology in Africa. So to help me to have that conversation today, I'm with Hlumelo Fungile, and he's the Chief Commercial Officer at PAIX Data Centres. He will share more on what exactly it is that they do. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast, and I look forward to quite an insightful conversation. Hlumelo, how are you, man?
Well, thank you for having me, Ephraim. I think this is long overdue. And, we need to wove the African storytelling and the arc of technology transformation on our continent. And so I'm very, very, very appreciative of this opportunity to have a conversation with you right now.
Let's kick off with what exactly that you do with regard to data centers in Africa. So just share a brief overview of that.
Yeah, so I think I go back. I have about nearly 20 years in this industry in digital infrastructure. I started off, Neartel, which was the second network operator in South Africa, almost 2 decades ago. Really part of a new revolution in terms of liberating telecommunication on the continent, but specifically in South Africa. My career sort of started from marketing, started climbing the corporate ladder, moved into sales. And really at the middle of the last decade, I started working with data centers specifically and began leading commercial transactions with very large hyperscalers. And, at the time, the most sizable achievement was actually being part of the team that brought the first hyperscalers to African shores in 2016, 2017, in landmark deals that are now very transformative in terms of how South Africans interact with technology, how businesses, startups basically are started, and really how they optimize and find efficiencies. And then my career has taken me to leading hyperscalers strategy for liquid and Africa data centers, including, then I took a sabbatical, started Hyperscale Africa, which is an advisory service in this very transformative area of digital infrastructure across our continent. And then recently started as head of commercial, chief commercial officer here at PAIX, where I lead all commercial transactions with all our customers. Yeah. So the second part is that, what has brought me into data centers specifically, I think data centers are the single most transformative infrastructure layer platform anywhere in the world. It's responsible for previously the cloud revolution, which started with AWS and EC2 in the early 2000s, which scaled and now is becoming the platform for AI as well, which is, highly transformative technology. And, my story is interwoven with digital infrastructure and particular data centers because I see it as a transformative factor in just how Africans can meaningfully participate in the digital world. And the era that's coming, one that includes robotics, one that includes health tech, fintech, just even education. It's transformative in so many ways. And it is important that the infrastructure is there, which is, it's got hidden sort of strings into policy, hidden strings into capital, hidden strings into the operators themselves. So this is it seems simple when you say digital infrastructure or just data centers, but it's highly convoluted and it has many dependencies that underpin it.
Let's go back to the late 2000s when you started in the field, right? How would you compare the state of the digital infrastructure then compared to where we are at the moment?
I think, at least from a business side, it was very common to see IT managers with a line of sight to their racks or their data center environments. They were on-prem. A lot of telephony was, the handheld telephone system that you had, lots of PBXs. In other words, it was very manual, very little automation. And I think that, at the heralding of the previous decade, we started to see transformation in terms of unified communications when a lot of those PBXs started to move to the cloud. Even internet access became more ubiquitous. More businesses had higher bandwidths to play with. So, started using more applications. And the higher the adoption on applications, the higher the efficiencies that those companies are able to derive. And then you move up the cloud stack, and that creates a demand for cloud solutions. And that's the reason why a lot of the hyperscalers started moving their infrastructure onshore in order to harvest some of this pipeline. To now where your business actually, all you want is to synthesize the inference. So the output, as the lingo would go in AI. So IT managers no longer want to manage your hardware and have a team that, technical staff that are managing their on-prem environments or have to deal with convoluted tech stack. They simply want solutions that are, a wide ecosystem, which they can tap into and get the output. They want to focus on their core capability. If you're a bank, delivering the highest level service to your customer, digital financial instruments that retain your customer, but none of the heavy lifting of, mainframes and servers and, even code is changing. You used to have a lot of developers writing a lot of code, and then someone to watch that person. We're seeing how that already is transforming, at least in the US, where code is being written at the frontier level, 80-90% by AI and self-correcting and, debugging and things like that. It's almost like in the last 2 decades, the world has shifted in ways in which I'm not sure even how human beings are able to keep up, because even if you're at the frontier, it's almost like we're in a make-believe world, or we're somewhat we've been temporarily portaled into like a matrix or something like that. I don't know, but yeah, it's radical what has happened in the last 20 years.
Whilst we are on the conversation of cloud, I think most people don't know this, but like the initial, you spoke on EC2, that what eventually became AWS was, it started in Cape. So on that, right, what role do you think we, like, as Africa has played in kind of like the growing out, especially, like cloud technology? Do you think we are still more like on the consumer part of it compared to like being a part of growing it out?
I think the story of at least a lot of South African innovators are sprinkled all over the modern tech world, from the Elon Musks, to the Mark Shuttleworths, to, this story about how EC2 and, modern cloud systems were actually started within AWS, but in Cape Town. But I mean, for me, it's a good story and it's a good narrative, but is it transformative for our people? Does it contribute jobs? Does it shift education? Does it impact things materially on the ground? And the answer to that is no. And so, I mean, this is why, for me, the arc of this digital transformation journey and my personal story and, what I do as part of my career is that I want to interwove those two narratives together, that this technology is not just something we cite in magazines or, we talk about here in podcasts, that we're able to create platforms, infrastructure platforms, dictate policy and work with governments in writing blueprints on how we can adopt a lot of these new technologies, bring or, advise capital, whether it's banks or, PE firms and other sort of financial structures, to bring capital to our shores, because the story of Africa is, to date, the story of, we are users, but it's not where the processing, the storage, the invention, the IP itself originates. And I think that's where I think a lot of my work is related. And I think that's the heart project for me. It's how we can start meaningfully playing in this space as opposed to an optics sort of view.
If you look at the infrastructure layer, I mean, the amount of capital investment that has to go in to build up these infrastructures is very, very heavy. If you look at, how, like Africa, like eventually did what they like to call the leapfrog to mobile, it just didn't happen, right? Like a lot of like investment went into these hours, etc., etc. Where do you think the gap is at the moment, like in terms of the amount of capital that's available to be able to build out this digital infrastructure? What role do you think, like stakeholders, like investors and governments, etc., can play in kind of trying to plug that gap? Because again, like to reiterate what I said in the introduction, without the infrastructure, we are not going to have the apps, we are not going to have the fintech apps, we're not going to have the e-commerce apps. So how do we kind of like plug that gap, like in terms of capital availability?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, these things are all interwoven together and they're interdependent. You cannot have capital if you don't have structurally the right investment thesis in order to invest in that market. That includes demand from local enterprises or government. That includes the right regulatory frameworks in order for investors to put in money, but also be able to extract that money as well. Then there's also infrastructure. Many of our countries do not generate enough electricity to sustain large sort of infrastructure projects like data centers. And then, there's other sort of auxiliary factors around green energy and things like that. So I've actually written a paper called the three-body problem in digital infrastructure, and it revolves around capital, operators, and hyperscalers. A lot of these things, there are precursors that need to happen before, maybe capital is dispersed. People can only, bankers aren't going to turn into, charity overnight just because, we need technology and we need to advance. There needs to be a core business thesis, a business case that actually supports and underpins any sort of investment. I mean, the other thing is that the sovereign AI opportunity is one that I think is well within our wheelhouse as African states, because if you look at when cloud infrastructure started to arrive or hyperscale infrastructure started to arrive in the Middle East, it was almost coterminous to when the first availability zones started to pop up in South Africa. So their starting points as far as this digital infrastructure, specifically data centers, was almost in the same time period. However, if you look at where they are in terms of the development of their data center industry and localizing AI clusters, investing at the chip level, and of course, money talks in this as well. But it also shows us a blueprint in terms of how governments can use local workloads, their workloads themselves, their own investment, a robust policy framework in order to bring and onshore a lot of infrastructure. And the Middle East, some of the Nordic countries, we're seeing India, and right now there's a whole AI conference that's going on there. So nations are actually, they're seeing this as a national security apparatus. They're seeing this as a national development opportunity. And then the government is taking leadership in talking and negotiating directly with hyperscalers, these model operators, in localizing specific AI deployments for execution within their own domain. You must understand, large language models are trained, they basically carve the internet and harvest the data, but it has abstract data. Africa is many, countries, many sort of interregional sort of sectors, cultures, mixes. How do we bring AI to work for us is to bring these clusters locally to have a more nuanced training and operation within the context of these African countries. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. I think government needs to do more. Our governments tend to take the back seat and think the private sector is going to be the driver of a lot of these initiatives. AI has a lot of national security implications and national development implications, which means then the governments cannot take the back seat. In a lot of these conversations, we're seeing the model where governments are they're taking control and driving the narrative.
If we come to Africa, right, I mean, I think you and I both know this, that our governments tend to move extremely slowly, right? If you look at the alternatives that we have, right, do you think that, private capital can play a significant role in this? Because if you look at the US, and I think it might not be the best thing to compare the US to us, but a lot of these infrastructure projects, especially at the boom of AI, are driven by private capital, right? Because private capital understands that you might not be able to see a return now, but there's a lot of value in this, and they've been able to to contribute a lot towards the growth of the data center infrastructure. So here, when we come back to Africa, what role do you think private capital can play in kind of plugging that gap that's left by governments?
I mean, if in terms of capital allocation, it will always be private capital that's most transformative. I want to make that point clear. But private capital does not move in isolation. As I said, there has to be the right market conditions. If you take the US, the reason why almost 80-90% of the infrastructure investment in data centers is happening in the US right now is that there is a direct correlation to that spend. And if there is adoption at the enterprise level, for that business case to make sense. And so they've mapped that quite clearly. What if you look at Africa, both as separate countries, but as a whole as well, have we proven that same model? Can we say, okay, cool, we have a use case, cloud arrived, what is the adoption rate? Various applications, what are the adoption rates? Are enterprises, is their data structured in a way in which it can, it can move to the cloud, it can interact with AI systems? So, and also everything starts by the size, of the opportunity. Obviously, the US has got the largest sort of opportunity size, and maybe Europe, Asia, and then it always cascades in that way. So you only have to follow the money, and then the story will make sense. So even today, in fact, 90% of it, almost, it's a rounding error. We can say 100% of it is of digital infrastructure investment in Africa right now is through private capital. Both offshore as well as local African institutions.
In terms of the demand at the moment, how would you gauge the amount of demand in terms of who you pitch to, who has an appetite for the rec space when you go out there to pitch clients?
Well, I think it depends on the market, but I think let me not say all, but let me say most African enterprises, large enterprises, have reached the point where I think all CIOs understand that an on-prem strategy is writing the book on how to lose, right? Because your systems are far removed from the ecosystems in which are transformative, which is, internet exchanges, cloud on-ramps, the resiliency and the rich ecosystem that you can find within data centers. And really, data centers is the first step before generally these customers advanced into the cloud, full cloud migrations. So right now, we're seeing a lot of banks making that move, a lot of the infrastructure that's still on-prem, they're moving that to data centers as the first step, whilst then adopting a model on which workloads can they move to the cloud later on. And so, yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of progress from the financial institutions because of competition. We're seeing, large enterprises, carriers. We're seeing even governments are starting to think about opportunities where they can work with operators like PAIX to say, you come in and through your alignment with Africa 50, which is the main shareholder at PAIX, which is, multiple African governments who started a fund for infrastructure initially, but later on included the remit for digital infrastructure. And so PAIX becomes nationally, these nations own it indirectly. And so it becomes the perfect vehicle for them to enact sovereign cloud or sovereign AI opportunities.
There's always this view by outside stakeholders that Africa is quite a market because they look at it as one market, right? A big market. But if you come to the ground, you realize that there's a lot of complexities from market to market, right? I mean, an example I gave someone was that it's so easy for Speed, the streamer guy, to go within 28 countries in a short period of time, but for a normal African, it's so complex. What do you think is the importance of kind of trying to consolidate the African market into one to drive the demand for the digital infrastructure like data centers?
It started with the advent, props to a lot of the network operators, some of the hyperscalers like Facebook and Google and some of their investments. So we started to see a lot of subsea investments, the arrival of Equiano, the arrival of 2 Africa, and before that, WAX, and even CCOM, who really was a transformative agent. And so by bringing the internet to our shores, where we're not routing, you must remember, before 2009, specifically in South Africa, and that means a lot of the neighboring countries and a lot of SADC, in order to get to the internet, you had to go to Telehouse in London and then break out to the internet, because a lot of the subsea cables that we had were low capacity, and the way the internet was sort of structured in Africa was not a lot of internet exchanges locally, so local traffic was sitting offshore. So with the arrival of all these subsea cables, a lot of these institutions have been localized. So data centers have IXs like NAP Africa, the largest internet exchange on the African continent. So for the first time after CCOM had arrived, we started breaking out to the internet from South Africa, going out. So the infrastructure layer is then the subsea, and then between large metros, having the right fiber architecture between Joburg, Cape Town, Harare, Joburg, all these main metros. As these networks started building out, the core metro becomes dense in terms of fiber rollout. Then you're talking about FTTH houses, now moving from CDMA or 3G or copper to now fiber connectivity. And so this pushes up traffic levels, and people's consumption of applications moves up. Businesses' consumption of applications move up, which drives demand at the other side, which is data centers, where all of these instruments are processed or stored. So it's all interlinked. And I think that in order to go from where we are, to where we want to be, where the world, where the US and perhaps Europe and parts of Asia are, is that we need to continue providing universal access of high broadband connectivity. We need to continue ensuring that we de-risk businesses moving critical workloads to the cloud. Because as those business cases build up, as adoption increases in markets, what you'll start to see is then the thesis for investment improves substantially. And then governments have a role to play in this, in creating the right kind of frameworks for investment, ensuring that the hyperscalers are, when they look at your market, if they look at Kenya, there's the right kind of power or green policy, there's the right kind of data policy, privacy policies, and things like that. And then AI is obviously a new frontier, and so there's new regulation that needs to come from that side of things. Yeah, so for me, it's, as I said, this is a very, very complex web of interdependent sort of factors, and various stakeholders need to play a role. It's not just simply ticking one box and everything sort of falls in place.
And I think that also, it brings me to my next question. In terms of the demand, right, in terms of like adoption of the digital services, etc., which of course like it cascades to the need for like data center capacity, right? Which stage of the cycle do you think we are in terms of the demand, right? Are we at the early stage, meaning that we are going to see like a lot of growth in the next few years? Are we like in the middle of the cycle? Where do you think we are? Because I'm assuming that, like as an investor, you want to know this, just to have an idea of, if I put in like capital, how much growth can I expect from this?
I think Africa, firstly, is not a monolith. So I think we can divide it into tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 countries. As far as, the investment thesis, South Africa is, until recently, it was the only true hyperscale market with multiple availability zones. Multiple in the multi-hundred megawatt workloads already live. So Kenya's developing, and we heard recently Oracle's investment there. We've heard about Microsoft also looking at a partnership with G42 to enter that market. So, that's an emerging market. Nigeria as well, we see some key workloads starting to pop up there, although key challenges remain as far as the underlying electrical infrastructure and its ability to support, even though there's demand, in order to support sustained demand over the next few years. Then Morocco as well is interesting because Oracle is well invested there as well, with live, or I think they're coming up if they're not already live. Clearly they invested there, and then Egypt is also on the pathway there. So those are, I think, our tier 1 markets where it's quite clear there's enough economic activity, there's the right population, and the business case roughly sort of balances. Then there's tier 2 markets like Ghana, maybe Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Angola, Ethiopia, which are maybe a little bit behind. But I think in general, Africa is right at the inception point. Even South Africa, within the global context, we're not even in mid-cycle yet. We're still at the start. Yeah.
So, as an investor, there's a lot of growth potential to look at, right? If you get in quite early, if you get in now.
Well, as an investor, I think obviously those that take the risk of getting in early can capture more market share. That's always the case. And can also optimize to the market dynamics. And by the time their competitors arrive, they have a little more know-how than some of their competitors. So it's always good to get in early, but obviously people's risks appetites are different. So it'll be case by case.
When we initially talked about this, like in 2023, right, the question that like I had for you was just around the irony of growth of the data centers, like in South Africa, when, obviously there were like a lot of like power issues, right? In terms of that challenge, right, what advances have been made towards trying to address that, like not only in South Africa but like across the continent, because I believe like power issue like is an African issue. What advances have been made to try to address that challenge, if you look at things like like a green energy, etc., etc.?
I think we underestimate the job that Cyril and his government undertook when they came into power. And relatively, if there's one achievement that I'll put on his collar, it's that the turnaround on, firstly, decoupling the energy Eskom into 3 sort of units: power generation, distribution, etc., was critical. Opening up, independent power producers, that framework, allowing them to build, allowing for investment to flow into the country in amazing ways, was a transformative sort of change. And to the point where now I think we're over 300 days, over a year of no official rolling blackouts or load shedding, is testament to a lot of that. And a lot of that is, I think, not just Eskom, but independent power producers that are able to now do wheeling agreements with Eskom to wheel power from wherever, whether it's a solar farm or whether it's a wind turbine, to wherever that power is going to be consumed. And we see a lot of the hyperscalers, like Amazon, who have done a lot of that, who bought power from almost wholesale, including investments in the independent power producers themselves, to generate new capacity to power their data centers. And so, yeah, I think South Africa's story is one that was necessary because I think it would have been an inhibitor for growth. It would have been an inhibitor for digital infrastructure, specifically data centers, because, already some hyperscalers were citing that, if you're running 100 megawatts in South Africa and, you're on a stage 3 or stage 4 rolling load shedding cycle, that's 3 or 4 hours a day where you're running diesel generators. And so if you look at their global renewable goals, it messes up their entire portfolio. You're running these massive diesel generators that are polluting the air 4 hours a day. It was becoming a serious problem. So yeah, I think South Africa has done a lot, and I think we need to ensure, because if you see what China is doing already, there is a direct correlation with a country's ability to produce power and its growth. It's a very clear, distinct, direct correlation. The more power is available, the more factories that can be developed at a lower cost, a lot more data centers, et cetera, et cetera. And then the value add of that trickles all the way down.
That was actually a follow-up question that I had, that when you are a hyperscaler, if you look at the power issue like in Africa, do you see it one as like a normal part of the capex? It's a hit that you just have to take because of the market itself, or do you see it as kind of like an impediment in you trying to like grow out your presence in the market, right? How do you think about it? You already answered a part of it, but if you have more to add, like you can add on that too.
African countries need to realize that globalization, I know there's parts of the world that wish for us to go back to a more segmented, more regional world. But I don't think the thesis of that is sound. And so I think globalization is here to stay, which means that countries need to remain competitive, not just regionally, but globally. Supply chains, the reason why China controls so much manufacturing is because globally they were able to optimize the input cost against any country around the world. And so I think that point remains even in digital infrastructure. I think you need to ensure that the price of electricity is competitive, not just for your local market, but also on the global marketplace. Because that is the thesis that says, maybe I won't go to, Johannesburg, and I'll go to, Nairobi, because the cost of power is cheaper there. And maybe it's more, they have a higher percentage of renewable mix in terms of their grid. And so these are realities. And I think that Africa has to do more in understanding we're not in a regional block called Africa or EMEA or whatever the case is. We're in a global world where Satya Nadella at Microsoft is looking at the world not as regions, but rather as global in terms of their global competitiveness and making decisions from that rationale.
If you look at like the major markets that you already stated, like this is South Africa, there's Kenya, there's Nigeria, Morocco. If you look at South Africa, it kind of acts as, like a peering zone for most of the markets in SADC, right? Where do you think is the value of us, as an example, of course, us like trying to consolidate our energy capabilities to be able to build out the, like a significant amount of supply to support the building out of the infrastructure? I mean, an example I can give right now, a majority of the electricity, like in Botswana, comes from South Africa. Do you think there is value in trying to pool our power resources in the region to be able to drive the development of the infrastructure?
If we remove sovereign interests, yes, I think there is clear delineation and there's clear advances or there's clear guidelines that make sense as far as that's concerned. However, I think you can never separate national interest from these kind of things. And so if Botswana wants to one day have their own data centers, it's not really a sound thesis to say, the power we're going to use to power those data centers is sourced from South Africa, because there is a technical component which is key there, and there's also a commercial one. The commercial one is that you're basically an intermediary. Whoever's I'm buying power from in Botswana is adding a markup from Eskom, right? So there's clear, I can get, the same energy cheaper if I just go to the source, right? So, and then there's technical components, which is, hyperscalers tend to want to build infrastructure quite close to where the generation happens. So there's those two impediments there. So I don't think you can separate the politics from some of the technicalities here, or even the commercial.
Yeah, but I think we have tried to do it a bit. I mean, if you look at what we've been able to achieve with an entity like SACU, I think we have tried to do like a bit of it where like try to align like our sovereign interest with the goodness for the whole region, right?
Yeah, but it doesn't always align. My point is that where politics meets business, there's always complexity, and unfortunately, the solutions there are more chaotic rather than symbiotic, in my opinion. Yeah.
So just again, because like at PAIX, you look at like entire continent, right? In terms of strategy, right? Where do you think we are headed in terms of like being able to avail the infrastructure that we need to be able to drive the next era, like of technology, AI, what have we been able to get right? What do we need to work on a lot?
What I would say is that I think different countries are in different places. A lot of Africa, most of Africa is unfortunately not even part of the thesis, in the sense that their only contribution is the end utilization. So they'll leverage apps like ChatGPT. They're on TikTok. They'll use Microsoft's suite of services. And really, they'll generate end users, but really, in terms of participation in the value extraction, that part is slightly unclear. Whereas I think places like South Africa and maybe Lagos, Nigeria specifically, and Kenya, and some of the other tier one African countries, by localizing some of these instances, by forcing the hyperscalers to look at these as a separate market, and bring compute and bring storage capability, bring dense networks, invest in assets on the ground, which means then those assets need to be supported by technical resources, empower and train local resources to support that infrastructure. Then developers are necessary, because development hubs sort of pop up as well, which then, once a lot of the building stones for applications are concerned, are localized, like the storage, like EC2, then latency is off the table. And now startups, businesses can build businesses from day one in the cloud, which was not possible before localization. Enterprises can now move and be more agile and more efficient in leveraging these kind of systems. So the transformation is real, but for most of Africa, they're excluded by virtue of their lack of ability to be attractive as a global destination for this kind of investment.
We already touched on this a bit, but let's speak on the ownership of the infrastructure, right? I mean, you already shared that like a lot of these projects are funded by private capital, which like in most instances is external, right? But if you look at the continent, the amount of assets that we have, like in pension funds, etc., it is a lot of capital, right? What risk do we face by not being like in a position to own our own infrastructure? Because even if you have like internal investors, they're always quick to exit at the earliest opportunity, right? So what risk are we running by not being like in a position to like be able to own this infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, it's one that I'm very passionate about. And I think we've previously discussed this and explored this topic slightly. It's basically like, it's a similar scenario to a foreign entity or a foreign country owning your ports, owning your main transportation routes. Digital infrastructure in this era is so foundational to national security and national development goals that, for me, this is the part where I think governments are sort of getting the wrong narrative, because they just think that any investment is okay. And yes, to a certain extent, any capital inflows are good. It's a good indicator. But I think we need to see a lot more African originated capital flowing into this, because these systems are basically the utilities of the past. These are the systems that are the operating system for the world that we're moving into. And so if you don't have sovereignty, in terms of what is moving through them. It's content, what frameworks are being used, what is the purpose, what is the destination, what is the source, the implications are dire.
And also, I mean, as like an investor, like in this space, I'm assuming that your, like timeline to be able to exit at multiples of like 20 to 30 of your investment is not going to be anything that's less than 10 years, right? So it's kind of perhaps like 10 to 15 years or so, right? So there needs to be that little bit of like patience to be able to hold on and say, this is long-term investment because we are basically like investing in the future of the continent, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the era of 20 to 30 multiples is maybe slightly behind us, especially in data centers, but maybe it's coming back because of this recent sort of AI boom. But I agree. I think the current private equity investment thesis is vesting in somewhere around 7 years. So in those cycles, they've got LPs that are simply promised a certain return, and they operate on that guideline. And they buy assets and they sell the assets as necessary. And my point is, those interests, those capital interests, are not always aligned to developmental or sovereign interests, which is why then, to our previous point, the need for sovereign or capital that is aligned with the country's developmental goals is necessary in order to have a more sustainable digital infrastructure growth map. Yeah.
As we close off, right, like if you look to 5 years or so from now, what would you gauge as the success of Africa's digital infrastructure goal? Like, are we going to look at the amount of capacity that we have, or are we going to look at how widespread the infrastructure is, in that it won't just be in South Africa, like Kenya, like in Nigeria and Morocco? Or do you think it will be more around like how we are, able to solve the energy problem?
Yeah, I think you hit a few points there, which are accurate. I think the next 5 years will focus on regional diversity for hyperscalers. So you'll start to see them pop up in other places and other parts of the continent. I think South Africa will continue to scale in the way that it does, because South Africa, geographically, it's nice and close to serve a lot of SADC. So anything from the DRC downwards is uniquely solvable out of South Africa. And I think there's concerns where it's like in the US you can have one data center that is larger than the cumulative capacity of all of Africa's data centers. So I'll give you an example. One of the OpenAI and Oracle's developments, they announced, whether they're doing it or not, I don't know, but they announced the gigawatt data center sort of development somewhere in Texas or something. If you look at cumulatively today, all of Africa's capacity, data center capacity, it does not add up to 1 gigawatt. So for me, the next 5 years is about then trying to rewrite that story. You can't have this 1.3 billion people, and then you have data center capacity that is less than a single metro in a developed country. Like, you can see how underserved our people are, and that stifles innovation. It stifles development. It stifles adoption. It stifles ultimately transformation. And so, for me, the narrative needs to change. I think we will cross a gigawatt quite soon. And then the question is, how do we get to 5 gigawatts? And that's a story of power generation and policy, as well as...
Let's close off on the question of policy. If you were to advise policy kind of stakeholder right now, like in any of the markets or like in Africa in general, what would be that key advice?
Yeah, I mean, this is Africa is where it is because of deeply systematic period of time in which we were colonized, and a whole lot of other institutionally discriminatory policy and frameworks that the Europeans did. So for me, we're not going to solve a lot of these challenges simply by snapping our fingers and thinking that we can generate a gigawatt of electricity. I think we need to look at 2 of the 3. So if you have policy, you have capital, you have hyperscalers, look at two of those that you can optimize for your local market. How do you get more investment in energy? That's critical. There's a clear correlation between a country's ability to generate electricity and their ability to develop and build out factories and data centers and new businesses, etc., etc. Two is your policy framework. Can people put in money and get it out without too many hassles? That's a very big thing, because a lot of capital is outside of that country. It's not inside that country. So fiscal policy and that framework is going to be very, very important. Then your data policy, your digital policies, are they friendly to multiple internet service providers, multiple carriers? Do they allow data centers the autonomy to do their work? The principles of ensuring that data is encrypted, privacy laws, things like that. So that's one framework. Then the last piece is ensuring that I think they can start looking at initiatives like building special economic zones, where they're incentivizing data centers to build, or operators to come and build data centers. And there are clear tariff benefits, there's tax benefits, all of that. I think those are great models that have worked in other parts of the world. So I don't think you can solve every single challenge in one fell swoop, but I do think that there is a way in which you can look at where are you positively disposed as a country, and then focus on your advantages in a global sort of society.
I would like to thank you for coming on. I think this is an extremely important conversation, because I realized that wherever there's like these events, etc., we tend to talk and focus on the application layer, right? But we tend to forget that we need to be able to enable all these apps to be built. We need to enable the AI to be able to scale. We need that data centers, etc., etc. So I think it's a important conversation, and you have shared quite a bit. And we can speak on this the whole day, but I think you have shared like a lot. Really, really appreciate your time, Hlumelo.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. Looking forward to continuing this engagement on and off platform, because I think that for me, it's not the conversation that matters. It's that the conversation drives transformation. And I think that's important.
Harm Sermon, really appreciate your time.